So I want you to imagine that it's the spring of 1976. You walk into your local hobby shop. Maybe you're looking for some new wargaming miniatures.
Or just a fresh set of dice.
Yeah, exactly. Just picking up some dice. And you scan the shelf, and you see this really small, unassuming booklet. It's thin. I mean, it's held together by just two staples in the spine. And it's got a price tag of $5.
$5?
$5. And the title on the cover reads Eldritch Wizardry. Now, looking back from where we sit today, it's really easy to just dismiss this as another dusty old rule book in the long, long history of Dungeons and Dragons. But if you were there, holding that little booklet in '76, you were actually holding a cultural time bomb.
You really were. It was a massive pivot point. And that's what we're doing a deep dive into today. Eldritch Wizardry, or as it was technically known back then, Supplement 3 for the original D&D White Box.
Right.
And our mission here really is to explore how these 60 pages managed to take a game that was mostly about hobbits and dungeon crawling and completely transform it into this weird cosmic horror experience.
While inadvertently kicking off a moral panic that would last for a whole decade.
Yeah, that too. It's a fascinating case study because it marks the exact moment the game stopped being just a pastiche of fantasy tropes and started becoming its own distinct, very weird thing. We're going to be looking at the primary source text itself, obviously, but also the corporate history of TSR and retrospective reviews from the gaming community to figure out why this specific little book matters so much.
So before we crack the cover open, let's set the stage a bit. It's 1976. The original D&D box set, the famous White Box, has been out in the world for about 2 years. Players have already digested the Greyhawk and Blackmore supplements. So what was the vibe in the basement game rooms back then? Were people just happily killing orcs and looting chests?
Well, the novelty was definitely wearing off. By 1976, if you were a hardcore player, you knew the monster stats by heart.
Right, you'd memorize the math.
Exactly. You knew that trolls regenerate unless you use fire. You knew all the optimal spells to cast. The game was honestly becoming routine. In the foreword to Eldritch Wizardry, the authors explicitly lament that it was becoming next to impossible to beguile players into danger or mischief.
I just love that. I love the idea that the developers were actively annoyed that their players were winning too much.
Yeah.
They're too safe. We need to fix this.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
Safety is boring in a game like this. So the solution they came up with was a massive philosophical shift. Up until this point, D&D was very rooted in high fantasy. Think Tolkien, obviously, but also Poul Anderson, Robert E. Howard. It was swords, sorcery, dragons.
Very traditional.
Very. But Eldritch Wizardry takes this sharp left turn into weird fiction and science fantasy. We're talking H.P. Lovecraft, Jack Vance, Clark Ashton Smith.
So we're effectively moving from Middle-earth out into the cosmic void.
We are shifting from a stone castle to a star chart. We are expanding the multiverse into the astral and ethereal planes. But here's the key context for this shift. This wasn't just the work of Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom, even though their names are the ones on the cover. This book is a classic example of what historians call the diver's hands approach.
Diver's hands. That sounds like something I'd find on a random loot table.
It really does. But it's an old literary term. It basically means a synthesis of many different creators. While Gygax and Bloom got the cover credit, the special thanks section lists people like Steve Marsh and Dennis Suster.
Who were they, exactly?
They were guys running their own home campaigns, coming up with these wild, out-of-the-box ideas, things like Indian mysticism or really intricate druidic lore. And TSR basically took those homebrew ideas and retrofitted them into the official rules. So it was this patchwork of different visions stitched together to create something totally alien.
Speaking of alien and speaking of that time bomb quality we mentioned earlier, we have to talk about the cover art.
We definitely can't avoid it.
It is the first full-color cover for a D&D supplement. It was painted by Deborah Larson, and it depicts a nude woman bound to a stone altar being supervised by these ominous robed figures, and there's this giant glowing rock. It's a lot.
It was incredibly provocative for 1976. Tim Kask, who was the editor, later admitted that they debated it heavily internally. They knew they were going to catch, and I quote Kask directly here, a lot of flack about those boobs.
Wow.
Yeah, but they went ahead with it anyway because they really wanted that pulp fantasy aesthetic, that Conan the Barbarian 1930s weird tales kind of vibe.
And at first it was fine, right? Because the only people buying these booklets were adult wargamers.
For a very short time, yes. But this book is widely identified by historians as the precise flashpoint for the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. When the game went mainstream a few years later, religious groups found copies of Eldritch Wizardry. You had the nudity on the cover, and inside you had clinical taxonomies of demons and literal rules for human sacrifice.
It was basically the smoking gun they were looking for.
Exactly. It forced TSR to eventually remove demons and devils entirely from the game in 1989 when they launched the second edition. But the legal trouble didn't even stop with the religious groups. This book also got them in hot water with the Tolkien estate.
Oh, right. Is this where the Balrog issue comes in?
It is. So in the first 4 printings, if you turn to page 3, that giant creature with the whip and the fire, it was explicitly labeled a Balrog. They just lifted the name straight from the Lord of the Rings.
I assume the Tolkien estate didn't love that level of homage.
They sent a cease and desist letter very quickly. By the 5th printing, the name was hastily changed to type the S demon, and later it officially became the Balor. But this actually signals a much bigger shift happening within the company. If you look at the back of the book, you can see their logo changing.
From the lizard to the wizard.
You got it. They started with a logo of a lizard man standing on a rock. It looked very indie, very garage operation. But around this time, they switched to the stylized wizard logo. It really shows TSR growing up, dealing with intellectual property law, and becoming a real corporation. They were realizing that they couldn't just steal from their favorite fantasy books anymore without consequences.
So we have the controversy side of things. Let's get into the actual gameplay mechanics now, because this book introduced some things that are absolute staples of the game today. Specifically, I want to talk about the druid.
The druid is such a fascinating example of that diverse hands collaboration we talked about. It was created by Dennis Sester, who is actually credited as the Great Druid in the front of the book. Originally, back in the Greyhawk supplement, a druid was just a monster you fought in the woods. Eldritch Wizardry made it a class you could actually play.
I feel like today, we just think of the druid as a nature cleric.
Yeah.
You know, you hug some trees, you cast Cure Light Wounds on the party. Was it the same back then?
Not really. It was much more distinct and honestly much weirder. It had incredibly specific, flavorful restrictions that forced you to roleplay in a very certain way. You had to be human. You absolutely could not wear metal armor under any circumstances, only leather and wooden shields. And your weapons were limited to things like daggers, sickles, spears, slings. It felt ancient. Almost pre-civilization.
And I saw a note in the sources about shape changing. I assume that was their big combat trick, right? You turn into a bear and maul the goblins.
Well, you could do that, but that wasn't actually the main utility of it. In Eldritch Wizardry, shape-changing was your primary way of healing yourself.
Wait, really? Just the act of transforming healed you?
Yes. Transforming healed 10 to 60% of the damage you had sustained. So if you were beaten to an absolute pulp, you could turn into a wolf and suddenly regain over half your health. It made them incredibly durable, but in this weird biological way rather than just casting a shiny healing spell.
That is a huge amount of healing. But the thing that really stood out to me when looking at the sources was the social structure of the class. It felt less like a standard character class and more like joining a secret society.
This is something early D&D did that has largely been lost in modern role-playing. The class had a hard mechanical cap on how many high-level druids could exist in the game world. You could level up normally until level 11, but there could only be a very limited number of druids above that level in the entire world.
So if I'm playing a druid and I've earned enough experience to hit level 12, but all the spots in the world are taken,
then you have to find one of the current level 12 druids and challenge them to a ritual duel. If you win, you take their rank and they drop down to your previous level.
that is absolutely brutal. It's like Highlander. There can be only one.
Exactly. And think about what that does to a gaming group playing at the table. You're in the middle of a dungeon, you're looting treasure, and your druid player just says, hey, sorry guys, I heard the archdruid is 3 towns over. I have to go fight him to the death right now or I literally can't get better at magic. It creates this massive, disruptive side quest, completely driven by the mechanics of the class.
It adds so much drama to the campaign. But while the druid was a huge hit, there was another system introduced in this book that, well, looking at the historical reviews, people seem to really hate it. Psionics.
Ah, psionics. The science fiction injection. This was the most polarizing edition in the book, and honestly, maybe in the entire history of original D&D. It was based on Steve Marsh's research into Vedic traditions. Ideas about Indian mysticism, chakras, the unlocked potential of the human mind. It was a complete departure from the Western, waving a wand style of magic.
So this is mind over matter stuff. Why was it so controversial, though? Was it just way too strong?
It was controversial because it was incredibly complicated. It was a completely separate magic system that didn't use normal spell slots. It used psionic strength points, and the combat was a math nightmare.
Give me an example of how that works. Say I'm a psionic character and I run into a mind flayer. What actually happens at the table?
Okay, so before the physical combat even starts, in these microsegments of time representing the split seconds of the mind you enter psionic combat, you have 5 attack modes, which are labeled A through E, and you have 5 defense modes labeled F through J.
Okay, tracking so far.
You have to secretly choose an attack mode, let's say Psionic Blast, and the Dungeon Master secretly chooses a defense mode for the monster, say Intellect Fortress. Then you open a massive matrix table in the book. You cross-reference Mode A with Mode G to find the point cost and the specific effect. You deduct those points from your total. And you do this back and forth for multiple exchanges per combat round.
That sounds like it would bring the entire game to a screeching halt.
It completely did. It was labyrinthine. And the craziest part, actually gaining these powers physically destroyed your character.
What do you mean by that?
It wasn't free power. For every 4 psionic abilities you gained, you permanently lost 1 point of strength. You physically withered away as your mind expanded.
That is a serious, permanent trade-off.
And it gets lonelier too. Psionic characters completely lost the ability to attract followers. In early D&D, having an army of henchmen was basically key to your survival. If you were a psychic, you were physically weak and you were completely alone.
And the world became way more dangerous for you too, right? Because they introduced monsters in this book specifically designed to hunt you down.
The ethereal predators, yes. This is where the real horror element kicks in. They introduced the Thought Eater. It's described in the text as this skeletal platypus-like creature that swims through the ether.
A skeletal platypus. That is incredibly vivid.
It really is, and it eats your psionic points. But the terrifying thing is, if you run out of points, it doesn't stop eating. It starts eating your intelligence score. If it reduces your intelligence to 0, your character suffers brain death.
Just instant brain death. Terrifying.
And then you had cerebral parasites, which were these invisible ticks that infected your aura and just drained you dry over time. The game was essentially telling you, sure, you can have these incredible superpowers, but the universe is full of invisible things that desperately want to eat your mind.
It seems like there was a really big push for realism or simulationism in this book too, particularly when it came to physical combat.
There was. This is where we see the infamous weapon versus armor class table.
I heard absolute horror stories about this table.
The idea behind it is actually sound physics. A mace is heavy and spiked. It's great at crushing a guy in plate armor, but it's clumsy. A sword is great at cutting leather or cloth, but it just bounces harmlessly off steel plate. So Gygax and Kask made this massive granular table where you had to check your specific weapon against the specific armor type of the target just to get your hit modifier.
So every single time I swing my sword, I'm essentially checking a spreadsheet.
Essentially, yes. It slowed the physical game to the same crawl as the psionic game. Most players, and honestly even the designers eventually, just completely ignored it. But it shows that they were trying to add rigorous detail to the abstraction of combat. They wanted to feel intensely real.
Well, let's move from the math to the lore, because for me, this is where Eldritch Wizardry really shines. We've mentioned the demons briefly, but this book gave us the names we still use in the game today.
It gave us the whole taxonomy. Before this book, you just fought general monsters. Now you fought Type I through Type 6 demons. It felt clinical, almost scientific. And it introduced the demon princes. Orcus, the Lord of the Undead, and Demogorgon, the Prince of Demons. These weren't just big bags of hit points waiting in a room. They were endgame threats with distinct personalities.
And the book introduced artifacts.
Yeah.
Which, again, these weren't just a +1 magic sword you find in a goblin's chest. These were world-ending items.
The artifacts and relic system is arguably the absolute crown jewel of the book. Gygax and Bloom created items that were essentially nuclear weapons. The Hand and Eye of Vecna, the Sword of Kaz, the Codex of the Infinite Planes. But there was one that really signals that genre shift we were talking about earlier. The Mighty Servant of Luco.
The Mighty Servant. That sounds like, is that a golem?
It's basically a mecha.
A mecha.
Yeah, it's a 9-foot-tall automaton made of mysterious metal that your character literally climbs inside and pilots. It has crushing arms and it regenerates damage.
In a medieval fantasy game.
Yes. It's pure science fantasy. It breaks the medieval mold completely. But the catch with all these artifacts was what they called the gamble. You didn't just cast an identify spell on the item and start using it safely. The DM had to secretly assign its powers from a set of random tables.
How did that work in practice?
So let's say you find the Hand of Vecna. It might give you a prime power, like the ability to cast a death spell, but it would always be paired with a major malevolent effect that you as the player don't know about until it triggers.
Give me a scary example of a malevolent effect.
Well, one effect was that the artifact develops a literal hunger for human blood, or it physically transforms you into a demon over time, or in some really nasty cases, using a power just has a flat percentage chance to instantly kill you. They called it abysmate. Permanent character death.
So you're holding this ultimate godlike power, but every single time you use it, you're essentially pulling the trigger on a revolver pointed at your own head.
Precisely. It brought this incredible sense of dread to the treasure hall. And there's a specific bit of lore in the book that really cemented this feeling of ancient dread. It's known as the Sunk Fragment.
I saw that name in the source notes. Who or what is sunk?
It's a fragment of text that was added in the later printings of the booklet. It describes an ancient wizard named Sunk who possessed the Codex of the Infinite Planes. He thought he was powerful enough to use it to conquer the city of Brass, which is the home of the Ifriti in the fire dimension.
I'm guessing that didn't go well for him.
It went terribly. He was captured, tormented, and his body parts were literally scattered across the multiverse. But the inclusion of this story gave the world a real sense of ruinous antiquity. It told players, hey, people have tried this before, people much stronger than you, and they failed miserably.
And if you wanted to destroy one of these artifacts, say you realized the Hand of Vecna was slowly turning you evil, you couldn't just throw it in a fire or hit it with a heavy hammer.
No, not at all. The book listed mythic requirements for destruction. You had to melt the item in the core of a specific star, or you had to dissolve it in the blood of a cosmic horror, or you had to crush it under the heel of the Prince of Demons himself. These weren't just flavor text rules, they were instant campaign hooks. The destruction of the item became the entire adventure.
Which is straight out of Lord of the Rings, right? Taking the ring to Mount Doom.
It is, but it's twisted into something much weirder and much more hostile to the players.
So taking a step back here, we're looking at a 60-page booklet from 1976. It's got complex matrix math, weird pulp nudity, brain-eating platypuses, mecha suits, and nuclear-level magic items.
Yeah.
How do we sum up its legacy?
I would call Eldritch Wizardry a flawed but truly visionary masterpiece. It was undeniably messy. The psionics were a math nightmare. The combat rules were clunky. But it succeeded in its mission. It took a game about basic dungeon crawling and expanded it out to an infinite, incredibly hostile multiverse. It bridged the gap between the freewheeling white box era and the rigorous, codified era of advanced Dungeons & Dragons that was coming next.
It made the game grow up, essentially, even if it was going through a bit of a rebellious teenager phase at the time.
That's a very fair assessment. It introduced consequences that were bigger than just you lose some hit points. It introduced the idea that knowledge itself could be dangerous.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting for me. I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We talked briefly about the Easter eggs in the book. Gygax and Bloom, the co-authors, put their friends and families into the names of these artifacts. Vecna is an anagram for Jack Vance. Kaz is named after Tim Kask, the editor. Luco is Gary's son Luke.
Right, very personal, fun touches.
But think about the most famous ones. The Sword of Kaz and the Hand and Eye of Vecna. The deep lore of these items is entirely defined by betrayal. Kaz was Vecna's trusted lieutenant who betrayed him, cut off his hand and his eye, and tried to usurp his immense power. It's a story of a partnership ending in blood and total ruin.
That is the core of the mythos, yeah.
Now, consider that just a few years after this book was published, the real-world partnership between Gary Gygax and the Bloom brothers would completely implode. The Blooms would take control of TSR, they would exile Gygax to Hollywood, and eventually the entire company would be torn apart by bitter corporate warfare.
Wow. That is a haunting parallel.
Right. If Gygax and Bloom created these ultimate symbols of power and treachery together in 1976, was it a strange foreshadowing of their own future? Were they unknowingly writing their own destiny into those artifact tables? It really makes you wonder if the major malevolent effects weren't just for the player characters, but for the creators themselves.
It's a chilling thought. Art imitating life before the life part even happened.
Something to think about next time you roll the dice. That's all for this deep dive into Eldritch Wizardry. Thanks for listening.